In October 1999, two 17-year-old best friends left for a birthday party in a small town in Alabama. The next day, their car was found abandoned on a remote road. Inside the trunk, investigators discovered the bodies of both girls. For the next 24 years, detectives had no idea who committed the crime. They had the killer's DNA. They had evidence. They had thousands of pages of reports. But they did not have a name. Until one day, a new technology allowed investigators to trace the family tree of a man who had spent more than 2 decades living quietly within the same community. Before we begin, if you enjoy detailed true crime stories based on real cases, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Case Reopened. It helps support the channel and ensures you never miss another cold case that remained unsolved for years. The story begins on October 31st, 1999, in southeastern Alabama. J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett were best friends. Both were 17 years old. They grew up in a small community where most residents had known one another for years. They were ordinary teenagers looking forward to the future, planning for school, college, and adult life. That day was J.B.'s birthday. That evening, the girls decided to attend a party hosted by friends. Nothing suggested it would be the final night of their lives. The trip was supposed to be short, but at some point they became lost. According to later investigative findings, the girls ended up on unfamiliar rural roads. In the era before smartphones and GPS navigation, finding the correct route often meant asking strangers for directions or stopping at gas stations. J.B. and Tracie did exactly that. They stopped at a convenience store and asked for directions. Later, they called home and told their families they were on their way back. It was the last contact anyone would ever have with them alive. When the girls failed to return home, their families became concerned. At first, however, there was no reason to assume the worst. Teenagers sometimes changed plans or arrived home later than expected. But as the hours passed, the situation became increasingly alarming. By early morning, search efforts had begun. The following day, J.B.'s vehicle was discovered. The car sat abandoned on a remote road in Dale County. What investigators found moments later shocked even experienced law enforcement officers. Inside the trunk were the bodies of both girls. They had been shot to death. The community was devastated. In small towns, events like these remain in people's memories for generations. Residents began locking their doors. Parents became afraid to let their children go out at night. Everyone asked the same question: who did this? Investigators immediately launched an extensive homicide investigation. Witnesses were interviewed. Friends of the victims were questioned. Travel routes were reconstructed. Every detail of the girls' final hours was examined. The most significant discovery, however, involved biological evidence left behind by the killer. Even at that time, investigators understood that DNA could someday provide the key to solving the case. The problem was that in 1999, forensic technology was far more limited than it is today. The DNA was preserved, analyzed, entered into national databases, and then investigators waited. Months passed, then years, but no result ever appeared. There was no match, no suspect, no answers. Slowly, the case began slipping into the category of unsolved murders. For the victims' families, it marked the beginning of a nightmare that would last for decades. Every holiday, every birthday, every anniversary served as a painful reminder that the killer remained free. Over the years, investigators received hundreds of tips. Some seemed promising. Others quickly proved false. Potential suspects emerged. Rumors spread. There were even individuals who falsely confessed to the murders. Yet none of those leads produced a breakthrough. Each time, the investigation returned to square one. Meanwhile, the only reliable clue remained locked away in a laboratory. It was the DNA of an unknown man. As time passed, investigators began hoping that advances in science would eventually create new opportunities. And they were right. In the early 21st century, DNA technology advanced rapidly. New methods of analysis emerged. Databases expanded. More sophisticated identification techniques became available. Yet the murders of J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett remained unsolved. For more than a decade, it appeared the killer had vanished without a trace. But behind the scenes, A revolution was taking place that would transform criminal investigations around the world. That revolution was called genetic genealogy. At first, the technology was used mainly by people searching for information about their ancestors. Millions of individuals submitted DNA samples to companies that specialized in ancestry research. Few realized they were helping create enormous databases that would one day solve some of the most difficult criminal cases in history. Investigators in Alabama watched these developments with great interest. They did not yet know that the answer to the question they had been asking since 1999 was closer than anyone imagined. And when a famous serial killer case in another part of the country was solved through genetic genealogy, detectives realized it was time to reopen the murders of J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett. They still did not have a name, but for the first time in many years, they had genuine hope. And that was when the process began that would eventually lead to one of the most shocking arrests in Alabama history. The reopening of the case marked the beginning of a new chapter in an investigation that had produced no answers for nearly 20 years. Detectives decided to re-examine the DNA evidence collected in 1999. This time, however, they would not rely solely on traditional criminal databases. Instead, they turned to genetic genealogy, a method that identifies individuals by locating and analyzing distant relatives. The process was incredibly complex. Specialists examined thousands of records, constructed extensive family trees, and compared relationships spanning multiple generations. Every new detail helped narrow the list of possible suspects. Slowly, one specific direction began to emerge. Investigators traced a family connected to southeastern Alabama. They then began eliminating individuals by examining their ages, residences, and whether they could have been in the area on the night of the murders. Eventually, one name captured their attention: Coley McCraney. To many members of the community, he was the last person anyone would suspect of committing such a brutal crime. He was a husband, a father, a local pastor. For years, he had lived openly among people who respected and trusted him. That was what made the investigators' discovery so shocking. For more than 2 decades, no one had publicly identified him as a primary suspect, and yet the DNA evidence pointed directly to him. Detectives knew, however, that genealogy alone would not be enough to file charges. They needed direct confirmation. A discreet surveillance operation was launched. Investigators monitored his activities and looked for an opportunity to obtain a DNA sample without raising suspicion. Such tactics are often used in modern criminal investigations when authorities need to compare genetic material with evidence recovered from a crime scene. Eventually, they succeeded in obtaining a suitable sample. Laboratory testing produced the result investigators had been waiting for since 1999. The DNA matched. After more than 2 decades, detectives could finally identify a specific individual as the killer of J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett. In 2019, Coley McCraney was arrested. The news spread rapidly across the country. For the victims' families, it was a moment that had seemed impossible for most of their lives. For years, they had heard about new leads, new theories, and repeated disappointments. But this time was different. This time, investigators had scientific proof. The community was stunned as well. Many residents found it difficult to believe that a man known locally for years had been accused of murdering 2 teenage girls. Yet the most difficult stage was still ahead. The case moved to trial. Prosecutors presented DNA evidence as the central link connecting McCraney to the crime scene. Defense attorneys attempted to challenge certain interpretations of the evidence and offered alternative explanations. At one point, McCraney changed his defense strategy. He claimed that he had known J.B. Beasley and had been involved in a consensual relationship with her. It was a startling claim. Prosecutors argued, however, that no credible evidence supported his version of events. Instead, they presented witness testimony and investigative findings that exposed numerous inconsistencies in his story. The trial attracted significant media attention. More than 20 years after the murders, Alabama residents still remembered the case vividly. Every witness statement was scrutinized, and every day in court brought the families closer to the answers they had sought for most of their adult lives. One of the most emotional moments of the trial came from testimony provided by individuals close to the defendant. Particularly significant was the testimony of McCraney's wife, who was called as a witness. Her statements addressed events surrounding the time of the murders, as well as comments McCraney had allegedly made in the years that followed. For the jury, her testimony carried considerable weight. The trial lasted 8 days. During that time, jurors heard forensic evidence, DNA analysis results, witness testimony, and a detailed reconstruction of an investigation that had spanned decades. Then came the moment of decision. The jury retired to deliberate. The victims' families waited anxiously. After 24 years of uncertainty, they were finally about to hear an answer. The verdict was returned. Coley McCraney was found guilty on all charges. Tears filled the courtroom. For the families, it did not erase the pain. It could not bring J.B. and Tracie back. It could not undo years of suffering. But it meant truth. It meant accountability. It meant the conclusion of one of the longest and most heartbreaking criminal cases in the region's history. The judge sentenced McCraney to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For the first time since October 1999, the families could look toward the future knowing that the man responsible for the deaths of their daughters and friends had been held accountable. The case of J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett also became a symbol of the dramatic transformation taking place in modern forensic science. For years, investigators possessed the killer's DNA, but lacked the tools necessary to identify him. Only the development of genetic genealogy finally provided the answer. It serves as a reminder that even the oldest cold cases are not necessarily lost forever. Evidence preserved for decades may someday lead to a breakthrough. Technology continues to evolve. Methods that seem impossible today may become standard practice tomorrow. This case also demonstrates the importance of persistence. For more than 20 years, the victims' families refused to accept a future without answers. Detectives returned to the files. They re-examined old evidence. They searched for new opportunities. And ultimately, their determination paid off. J.B. Beasley was 17 years old. Tracie Hawlett was 17 years old. Both had their entire lives ahead of them. Although justice arrived after a long delay, their story was never forgotten. After 24 years, the truth finally emerged, and a case that once appeared impossible to solve became another example that time does not always protect those responsible for terrible crimes. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy detailed true crime stories based on real cases, leave a comment, like this video, and subscribe to Case Reopened. We'll see you in the next case.